Okay, welcome everyone. This is Agential Topics. It's September of 2025, and I'm Charlie Munford. I'm the chairman of Talking Octopus. Talking Octopus is an organization looking to build a physical model of agential biology, and this is the group where we try to figure out what agential biology really is. So, so this month we have Terrence Deacon. And without too much introduction, he's going to give us, we're going to work together on his theory of semiotics. And I will just, I will just begin right away by with a question or I guess a request to Terry because his paper the paper that we read, How Molecules Become Signs, begins with a rather succinct and I think brilliant introduction of the distinction between two understandings of the word information. And so Terry, tell us how your paper begins and tell us what's your view of Shannon's theory of information is.
All right. Well, this is going to take up a chunk of time, just because not only is there, I think, one meaning, but three meanings of information that we often both confuse um, and think we're talking about and understand in different ways depending on who's interpreting it in what context. The three of them, I think, correspond to an idea that actually was originally presented by Charles Morris, the philosopher back in the 30s, who was following philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce from the turn of the century. And the three that he identified as a man interested in linguistics was syntax, semantics, and pragmatics, something that every linguist is familiar with. It's interesting that in information theory, we have never adequately, I think, broken up our analysis that way. I think that is, of course, overly linguistic in its interpretation. If we're going to use it to talk about biological processes and possibly machine processes, we need to be more complex. And so I distinguish these as basically a structural or statistical analysis, formal analysis of information media, which I'll call structural information, um, a referential version of it in which we talk about what something is about. You have a signed vehicle, something, a structure or a formal feature, and we use that feature to talk about something else that's not there. That's a referential relationship. That's, in a sense, it's not an intrinsic relationship. It's a relationship between something present and something absent or something displaced. And then there's a third aspect, which has to do with the use. And I think we can call this normative information and distinguish, in fact, correct information, incorrect information. We can still refer to things incorrectly. We can still have reference and useless information. So if I tell you something that's completely redundant, to some extent it's not useful, but it may still be referential. And there's a hierarchical dependence here, so that anything that is useful has to be referential. Anything that's referential has to have structure and statistical organization to it. So there's a hierarchical dependence as well in three ways of thinking about information. That, in effect, just opens the door to even more complexity. And this is where the semiotic side of it goes into it. And why I think, again, we're confused even at the second stage of referential information, because things can refer by virtue of different
Yeah.
properties of the signed vehicle, different statistical formal properties of a signed vehicle. That is by virtue of some isomorphic relationship between it and what it represents, some correlational or physical relationship between what it represents, and then some relationship that's just determined by an interpretive process. For example, we all are using English here, and we have the same interpretive process to use when we interpret concepts like information or like word or like dog or whatever. So long as we're using the same interpretive process, we can still use it to communicate. and still use it to gain reference and use. But again, like I said, even completely referential information, which we really understand the reference of, if if we, in a sense, find that it's useless, misleading, um, its normative features are, in a sense, inappropriate, then there's no use. My view of this is that that hierarchy of dependency in which the most important first step to look at this is to look at the structure. If it doesn't have certain structures, it can't be referred to something else in a certain way. And if it doesn't refer to something in a certain way, in a way that's understood in interpretive processes, then it's useless or at least misleading. So that's the first complication. And I say it's just the first complication because when we want to talk about how information comes about in the world, we have to actually reverse this logic. And this is something I think is even more troublesome. And that has to do with what you might call a genealogical versus a functional analysis. And let me see if I can make that clear as well. I think that before anything can be refer to anything else, in effect, there has to be some potential use. There has to be something that can take advantage of a present absence relationship. Um, a living process can do that, of course, and that's one of the critical pieces. Then the question is, once you have that relationship established, can you fine tune it? Can you make the sign vehicle, the medium, more precise and more clear cut in this process? I use this to talk, and those of you that have looked at the papers I've published, as well as some of the online discussions I've had about the evolution of biological information, I think we always get this backwards. And it's captured so well by the RNA world perspective or the replicator first kind of perspective to the origins of life, which assumes that something like RNA or DNA precedes everything. And just the copying of that sign vehicle is all you need for evolution or for life. I think that actually has everything exactly backwards. For me, it's sort of like imagining that language creates brains, that you need language first and then brains come out of it. Of course not. You know, it's backwards. What you need is that we recognize that there are certain molecules that carry certain affordances that make them good media. But you've got to have a use first. You've got to have a normative feature first. You've got to have what I like to call normative chemistry in order to have reference, to utilize some other chemical features as referential, and then to fine tune them for being easily copied, unlikely to be damaged by that copying process or the use process. So I actually think that the sequence goes peptide system first, RNA-like system second, DNA-like system third in the course of evolution. I like to think of this as the Fuca to Luca transition, Fuca being first universal common ancestor of all life, Luca being the last universal common ancestor of all life. All living things, for example, basically use some variant of the same genetic language, whether you're a bacterium, a eukaryotic cell, a plant, an animal, or even a virus. They all use the same code system, that we have this complicated RNA ribosomal coding system that had to persist to, had to pre-exist those molecular systems. Somehow that system had to be generated. This is the what I call the Fuca to Luca transition. There, how do you produce this really incredibly complicated ribosomal system that has hundreds of transfer RNA and ribosomal RNA molecules in an incredible complication system in order to interpret? That interpretation system had to precede. The question is, how do you construct that order if you can't use the sort of inverse functionality in our argument? Yes, when we look at living things today, DNA precedes the RNA precedes the proteins. What I want to suggest is that's, in a sense, reverse engineering, but evolutionary genealogical processes are going to be the inverse of that. Um, I think there's a good way of thinking about this in terms of what Stephen Jay Gould and Elizabeth Verba called exaptation. Darwin recognized this as well. Everything that's functional now had a different function at some point in the past. And that function had a different function at some point in the past, and so on and so on and so far backwards. We can't use current function and then just say, okay, we reverse engineering the current function to figure out how it came about. That won't work. The nature of evolution is it always rewrites itself. And so you can't use current function to say, just take it apart and see how it works, and that's how it must have evolved. My argument is it had to evolve in an inverse direction. So I've said way too much already about
Right.
information, but I want to make it clear that
No,
so I
that's
think the problem
beautiful.
of information is so complicated.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. I'm so glad you broke it into three pieces instead of two, because I was just thinking about the like communication aspect versus the usefulness, and you put in reference as a
Middle.
third in the middle. Um, and so let's yeah, so that's great. That's even better. Um, so let's go into what you think of interpretation. Like, how do you define interpretation, and what is minimal interpretation, and what I'm kind of leading you into the idea of an autogenic virus.
Right. So that's for me a useful, you might say thought experiment model system. The good news is that it is an empirically testable argument. And I'm working with people trying to get people to figure out how to test it, but we'll come back to that a little bit later. Um, the the real key issue here, I think, has to do with our misunderstanding of interpretation. And this is an area where I think we begin to get a better sense of it using Charles Peirce's approach. I don't think Peirce had it all worked out. I want to be clear, I'm not a Peircean fundamentalist in this respect. In part because he's writing at the beginning of the 20th century. He's writing it in a context, to some extent, an anti-psychologism context. He's trying to say, I don't want to talk about minds. I want to talk about, he calls them quasi-minds sometimes. And he uses this process of interpretant generation, which is, people outside of the sciences just want to say, oh no, it's just three parts. It's just sign, object, interpretant, and that solves it. It's a three-part relationship. No, it's much more complicated when we want to ground it in real physical scientific processes. And I think that's what we have to do ultimately. Otherwise, semiotic theory is going to be just a humanistic theory. And we got a long ways to go in that respect. But so let's talk about interpretation. The first thing is in that paper that you cited, I sort of with a tongue-in-cheek sense lay out what I call the fundamental dogma of semiotics. Now I use this as a tongue-in-cheek because, of course, this is the dogma that the Crick dogma about DNA to RNA to protein as a dogma of how to understand biological information. This is a dogma in the same sense that I think it's more complicated than this, but I want to be clear about where this, how should I say, where to look to find the interpretive process that you've been looking for, that you've been asking about. And a way to say this is that anything can be a sign vehicle to refer to and be used for anything else by any referential relationship, isomorphic, correlational, arbitrary, depending on the interpretive process. Nothing is intrinsically semiotic. Nothing is intrinsically a sign. But things can have affordances, physical properties that can be used by an interpretive process. What this says is the interpretive process has to come first. There are not things in the world that are naturally signs. Now, here's the process with the Shannonian concept of information. If we collapse these ideas of information that I've just broken up into three, and say, no, there's things that are intrinsically information, not distinguishing the structural, referential, and normative features. Just say everything is just, intrinsically information. We can now say, well, black holes destroy information, like the physicists often do. Now, what they're talking about is something much more abstract and collapsing all these features. They're just talking about structural information. That is something that if I stand back and ignore all these other features, I can say, I can come up with a statistical model for the complexity of some artifact and what its properties are. But that doesn't tell me how those properties might allow an interpretive process to gain access to something very different than that intrinsic property. So the interpretive process is crucial. So what I'm going to make clear is interpretation precedes semiosis, or rather, semiosis is
Right.
interpretation. And therefore,
Yes.
anything can be a sign vehicle, so long
So,
as you've got the appropriate interpretive process. Go ahead.
and that interpretive process, correct me, like just to restate, is about making use of affordances that whatever that sign vehicle gives in a physical sense. Um, okay, so um now lead me into like how that structure, like how you build up that thought experiment with the autogenic virus, because I see that as like I see that as a sort of structure that's using these affordances for self-repair. And I want to
Exactly.
get into the concept of self-repair and see how deep we can make that, because that's a super critical idea and
Absolutely
really
is.
fascinating. So
So,
so
so let me,
show us that picture.
good. So let me link it to what I said before to get us started. Um, my argument has been that you have to begin from something normative that can take advantage of some relationship between something that's present and something that's not present or potential. And only then can you find sign vehicles, media, that can provide that function. So starting from what amounts to a concept of function, unfortunately, sadly for philosophy, I think that means we have to make sense of teleology right from the start. End directedness, specific end directedness right from the start. What makes something end directed? Because I think that that's what makes something normative. Because if there's an end, if there's a target, if there's an aim, then you can miss that target. You can be wrong about it. There can be something that doesn't work and other things that do work. Well, chemistry without life has no normativity. I want to see if I can make that as a starting point here. Chemistry without life, there isn't any good or bad reaction. There isn't any correct or incorrect reaction. There's just probable and improbable chemical reactions. Now, that's not normative in the sense of right or wrong, good or bad. That's just more or less. Um, and yet, with life, we have what I call normative chemistry. That is, there's chemistry that's good for something, chemistry that's bad for something, chemistry that's useful, and chemistry that's not useful. The question is, what kind of a system can create norms? What do you need to create norms? And here I'm talking about just normative chemistry, something really simple. What do you need? My argument is that you need something that we would gloss over and call a self, something that benefits or can be harmed. How can something be benefited or harmed? Can clouds be benefited or harmed? Can mountains be benefited or harmed? Can stars be benefited or harmed? Not in that sense. But life can, even viruses. So, a virus, for example, we can do everything we can to harm the virus that could harm me, or to benefit the virus that can kill my enemies, or whatever. We have all those features. And from a viral point of view, there are good cells and bad cells. There are immune cells and there are easily infected cells, even from a viral point of view. The virus has no point of view in that respect, but there is normative chemistry with respect to a virus. And what that tells us is that the locus of normativity is that which can be benefited or harmed, some unit that can be benefited or harmed. What constitutes something a unit? It's got to be physical. It's got to be individuated. It can't be sort of, globally all the chemistry in a different area. It's got to be something that's clearly individuated, and it's got to be benefited or harmed. So that's what I tried to come up with in this notion of an autogenic virus. What's the simplest chemical system that would have these properties? That's what I asked myself. It may not be. What I've come up with may not be the simplest, but it's the simplest as I could think of. And it's vastly simpler than life, vastly simpler than cellular life, even simpler than viruses. Most people today think of viruses as, well, they're not really alive, or they're just artifacts of cells, or they're secondary somehow. I actually think viruses precede cells. Most of our theories today about the origins of life treat cells, simple cells, as though you could have a super simple bacterium as your simplest form. But bacteria, as we know it, already have ribosomes. They already have thousands of genes. Even the simplest ones have thousands of genes because you got to produce ribosomes and you got to produce tRNA, transfer RNA. You got to produce, all of this stuff. So even the simplest cells have this. And cells are also complex because they have to have membranes that can let some things in and out and keep other things in or out. They got to, they're really complicated. So what I try to come up with is the simplest possible system that I could say produces normative chemistry. Or another way to say this, with respect to it, there are some chemical reactions that are normative, that are of value or not, or are dangerous. So the autogenic virus, it's a virus because it's only got really two components. How do you build a virus that is, by saying it's autogenic, that means it generates itself? It is not a virus that is parasitic. Can there be a virus that's not parasitic, that doesn't have the complexity of this DNA, RNA, ribosomal language that is now consistent in all existing life? What I realized is that you could replace something. What are the functional components of something like this? You've got to have things that generate something. The real problem is, of course, the second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics says that any process, whether it produces order or not, eventually produces more mixed upness than regularity. I don't like the term order because, in effect, we oftentimes just link it to what we think is orderly. Order is something that's less than completely chaotic. And there can be huge range of things that are less than completely chaotic. The key is that they're constrained. Constrained means that not all possibilities are expressed, not all degrees of freedom are there. So what I wanted to do was to come up with a chemical system that is that simple. How could it be that simple? And the answer is it requires two kinds of self-organizing processes that generate regularity. How does something generate regularity? Well, at the turn of the century, the last century, not this current one, but order was the big problem. Everybody was worried about the second law of thermodynamics, the potential heat death of the universe, and all that stuff was hot topics. And during the 20th century, the early part of the 20th century, a number of processes were noticed that generate regularities. My favorite one of these, that's been a favorite of mine since I was a kid, is snow crystals. Snow crystals form spontaneously and exhibit incredible regularity. They're, in effect, a memory or a record of all the temperature, humidity, and pressure zones that they've fallen through. as they drop down from the upper atmosphere into the present. And so that their structure has this remarkable symmetry and regularity and predictability. And yet, as we look at lots of different snow crystals, they're all slightly different because, of course, everyone has fallen through a slightly individually different temperature, humidity, pressure zone as they drop down through the atmosphere. They're self-organized in that sense. And what we've recognized since then, and now thermodynamics has made good analysis of these things. These are processes that become regularized because they're creating disorder in the larger environment more rapidly and more efficiently with less work. Um, and so this is this sort of a far from equilibrium process. Uh, this one of the simplest examples, of course, is a whirlpool. You're in your bathtub and you pop the cork up and you let the water drain out, and a whirlpool spontaneously forms. So now you've got regular flow. Regular flow is useful because all the molecules of water aren't bumping into each other and slowing each other down. Once they get laminarized into this flow, and the only way to make a good laminar flow around a hole is to make it circularly. So what's going on here is progressively and spontaneously to drain the tub, um, all the what I call discordant moves get canceled out because they get in each other's way. The molecules get in each other's way. Those that eventually overcome that are those that are laminar to each other in a whirlpool. What this means is if you're sitting in your bathtub and you watch the whirlpool form and then you mix it up, mess up its flow, you will actually slow the draining of your tub. This is because the laminar flow of a whirlpool is the fastest way to drain the tub. What this tells us is a very simple thing about self-organization. Self-organized processes destroy the gradients that drive them as fast and efficiently as possible. Okay, that's great, but we don't want that to be the definition of life. As soon as people discovered these wonderful order-producing processes, they got really excited. Oh, this life must be a self-organizing process. Look out! If life was a self-organizing process, war and fire would be the best thing. That speeds it up as fast as possible. That can't be the whole story. The real story is this. Life has to produce order, and therefore it has to use far from equilibrium self-organizing processes that are intrinsically self-undermining. And yet it must block that self-undermining tendency. So how does that happen? How can it block? How can self-organization be the basis of life and yet still block that self-destructive tendency? And the answer is self-organizing processes that both provide the essential conditions for each other and the boundary conditions on each other. Don't allow them to run to complete diffusion. Don't allow the system to run out of energy. Stop it before it gets there. And preserve, like the snow crystal preserves its history. Preserve the constraints that make it possible to do it again. So it's a do it again structure. I want to do me again. But now here's how I backed into the viral story. A virus has one clear self-assembling logic. Every virus self-assembles its shell. Self-assembly is crystallization. Crystallization is a process in which molecules that have certain geometries and affinities, electrochemical affinities, and so on, or hydrophobic, hydrophilic affinities, tend to stick together in regular crystallization forms, cells, or tessellations, sheets. Both are possible. Well, of course, viruses form by tessellation. They form tetrahedrons by peptides or proteins sticking together to form a hollow shell or tubes. You can form spirals, tubes. We have a lot of tubule systems in both the virus and the cell. that form spontaneously. Self-assembly means that these things fall together, stick together by virtue of falling into a lower energy state. All crystals form by virtue of giving off heat, giving off energy, giving off vibratory or rotational energy in the molecules, and sticking together. Uh, and of course, this is a process that, if you, when I was a kid, I used to grow crystals in liquid. You supersaturate the liquid with salt or sugar or some other molecule, and then you let it cool down. And when it cools down, then of course, molecules form into more regular forms. At some point, the rate at which the molecules attach to the crystal lattice and the rate at which they're released from the crystal lattice come to equilibrium, and the crystal stops growing. The crystal grows to a certain height, a certain size, and stops growing because it's used up all the free energy. The free energy is gone. Crystals stop at that point. The interesting thing, if you can produce a tetrahedron this way that closes itself, it can actually close itself before it stops, before it uses up all the energy. Because why? The system loses new facets for things to attach to. It becomes a closed structure. That's not quite the case with tubes. Tubes always have open ends. Okay, that's one side of the story. But the other thing that's necessary to grow something to a finite size is you can't run out of substrates and free energy before you got there. So for crystals to grow or for a tetrahedral shell to grow, as it absorbs new molecules from its surround and grows, it decreases the concentration of those molecules in the surround, and therefore it will slow its growth. Ideally, what you want to be able to do is to keep sticking new molecules in to the solution until it keeps growing to the point where it'll stop growing. What's the process that would do that? And what I realized is that this is another self-organizing process that is characteristic of all life, as is self-assembly processes like this. And that is catalytic circles, or what I like to call reciprocal catalytic processes. It's sometimes been called autocatalytic sets. Stuart Kaufman coined that term some years ago. But basically a series of catalysts where catalyst A produces catalyst B as a product, and catalyst B produces catalyst A as a product. That's the simplest recursive cycle. It could go through 10 or 12 different molecules in this process. The more there are, the slower the process will be, the more likely you'll have inappropriate reactions and so on. But there's no normativity here because the system will just run until it runs out of concentration, till it runs out of the substrates that it needs to build A's and B's, or A's, B's, and C's, and so on. So one of the problems with reciprocal catalytic processes is that they diffuse away from each other. They need each other, so to speak, but the catalysts tend to diffuse away from each other as their concentration grows, and they use up substrates as their concentration grows. So this is a self-destroying process as well. But here's what I realized, is that if an autocatalytic or reciprocally catalytic process generates also one of its side products that tends to self-assemble into a shell, that shell will tend to grow as fast as it can in the very vicinity where catalysis is going on as fast as it does. The two will co-associate, and that means that the self-assembling shell will enclose the very catalytic system that generates that shell. But that shell will now be finite as it stops growing. The catalysts themselves will now not diffuse away from each other. So the potential for future reciprocal catalysis is now contained. And the potential for future reciprocal catalysis is the potential for future containment growth, which is the potential for future constraint of catalyst diffusion. The two produce the necessary constraints on what they need locally, and also the constraints on not destroying their basic capacity. As a result, a system like this has the capacity, when damaged, to repair itself. And if damaged radically, two or more will be produced. This means
So
that something like reproduction is sort of secondary to self-repair.
so Terry,
Yeah, go ahead.
totally. Yeah, beautiful. So let me stop you right there because I want to kind of zero in on this concept of repair because so far we've had, and like I think most of us could probably just accept your premise. There can be an autocatalytic set, that can happen, and there can be catalysts that catalyze one another to form a certain entity, and but so then we have this idea of repair, right, where there's some impingement, the world, the umwelt, the rest of nature somehow impinges upon this structure that's maintained, that's assembled and maintained itself. And then there's a repair process. And to me, like your whole theory basically hinges on this repair process
Correct.
um being an interpretive process. And so if I'm hearing you correctly. And so the thing I want to zero in on is like intuitively repair, like when I think of repair in the context of organisms, I think of scars, wounds, regenerative limbs and so forth, things like that, which is further, way further down the
Way
road. And it's
complicated, yes.
also, and I think of brain. Yeah. So super complex. And so I know you want to put that aside, but in all those examples of like
I want to crawl
highly
before we can
complex
walk.
emergent repair, we see like the thing that's created. Yeah, okay, fine. But here's the essence of it is that the thing that it's repaired into is different. It's a variation of what it began as. It's not identical, right? There's like
Absolutely.
and to me that intuitively makes sense as an interpretive process. Like there's a wound, there's a damage, and there's a recovery process, and at the end of the process you have a different structure there. So it's going to use like its symbols, its DNA in a different way. Like it's learned something, right? But that depends on the thing that it's repaired into being different from how it began. And when I shrink it down to this tiny autocatalytic set, I have trouble seeing the repair process as anything but regenerating the exact same autocatalytic set. And so like the
The
jump
question,
to the
I,
jump
I,
right there as like that question is how different is the resulting structure from the one that started.
so first of all, the
Yeah.
danger is looking at the self, that which gets repaired, that which is the basis of the normative assessment, as being a physical thing alone. That is it identified with all of its physical parts? Obviously, in this process, there will be new physical parts. Um, Over the course of time in your body, now that we've all lived the decades that we've been around in order to have this conversation, most of the molecules in my body, your bodies, have been repaired. So if we were to say that your identity, my identity, was defined by the physicality, the particular material components, um, we would be missing something important. What is maintained? What determines the individuation? It's no longer the physicality of it. It doesn't mean that there can be non physicality. Of course, there's physicality, but what is it that's maintained during your lifetime? What's maintained is, of course, the form. What's maintained is how each of the parts are related to each other. Um, what I like to say is that that's effectively an issue. Let me just say, I've got something popped up on my screen. I've got to get rid of it here. There you go. Effectively, what's maintained is the constraints that hold the whole system together. So what we've got is we've got the constraints generated on self-assembly necessary to produce it and to keep it from running out, that's generated by the reciprocal catalysis. The constraint on diffusion that maintains reciprocal catalysis is generated by the enclosure, the shell that was produced, that was self-assembled. But there's a higher order constraint, and that is there's the constraint of their co-location and of sharing a component. That is one component from the catalytic cycle becomes part of the self-assembling cycle. And the self-assembling cycle keeps the other cycle together. So now we've got two constraints. These each constrains the other reciprocally. But that means there's also the higher order constraint that they must be co-localized and sharing something. That complex of constraints, there's what I would call the second order constraints that link the two processes together. And then the higher order constraint of their linkage. All of that system has to be maintained. That's what gets passed on. That's what doesn't get eliminated. But now you've got something interesting because it's now evolvable. It's evolvable because material parts can be changed without, in a sense, losing any of the details. The constraints are passed on. So when we say that during bacterial reproduction, a bacterium splits and reproduces two, two split reproduce four, and so on. What's passed on between them? Well, there's a little bit of material passed on, but mostly what's happened is they've generated redundant material in this process, and then they've, with their duplication of this material, split off. What's been maintained when we say the information that defines that lineage is not any of the particular material parts, but it's that collection of constraints that those material parts embody that can be re-embodied in other material. The constraints, I mean, this is the issue about constraints or about reference or about information. I mean, one of my favorite examples, I mean, I spent decades working with cell cultures and transplantation work and so on back in the 90s, cell transplantation. One of the things that we had to deal with, of course, is this whole question of, can you stick new genes into a new virus? We were using adenoviruses that have been destroyed so they can't infect, but which we can insert new genes into. There's now lots of new ways to insert new genes. But one of the things what we were using is we would go to the literature and find somebody that's identified a particular gene. And in the literature, of course, we see these letters, AGCT, AGCT, hundreds of them in a line, copy that out and go to a machine that you can construct a DNA molecule that has that sequence. Here's the interesting thing. This began by somebody analyzing destroying an organism, analyzing one of its physical molecules, and then translating it into another medium, the medium of text. You already had to know that, C is cytosine. That medium of text was generated hundreds of thousands of times, maybe in journals, passed all over the place. I find it online or in a library, and I take that sequence back and I type it into the machine and see if we can generate a similar molecule. And if we find a way to maybe insert it into a new cell, or in this case, into a new adenovirus, and see if it infects the cells in our culture. What's happened is that what's been passed from the original research that was done in somebody's lab 30 years before, maybe 20 years before, was turned into text that maintained the constraint so long as I had the interpretive system. He had an interpretive system to turn it into text. I had the interpretive system to take the text and turn it back into a molecule, and the interpretive system to put that molecule back into a virus. So long as the interpretive system was maintained, it didn't matter what the material substrate was that passed that system of constraints on. What was necessary was that the same interpretive apparatus was used so that it could reconstruct what was at the beginning of that sequence. So that what I'm trying to get at is that's what I wanted to find. A unit, a molecular complex, as simple as possible that I could think of, that would have the capacity so you could pass a system of constraints that, in a sense, recognized and interacted with its environment such that those things that were consistent with its tendencies would be incorporated. Those things that were inconsistent would not be incorporated. Therefore, it had normative chemistry. So what I wanted to create was the simplest system I could imagine to produce normative chemistry. The norms had to be determined by virtue of whether it damaged or benefited the interpretive capacity to produce itself. This is why the concept of self comes into this. I said it's self-reproducing. No, the self here is not the stuff. The self is this complicated, we would say it's information. And interestingly enough, even Shannon recognized that information, the message of information, is determined by constraint, by what amount of the original entropy of a
Totally.
signal is reduced, is constrained out. That's where there could be a message.
Yeah. Awesome. So I have some more questions, but Henry has his hand up, and I want to go ahead and open up and let
Sounds good.
people ask their questions. And if there's a good moment, I'll ask mine. But Henry, can you hear me? Uh,
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Henry Haynes.
Okay. So
Great,
I
great.
enjoy
Yeah, there
uh,
you go. Yeah.
first I enjoy
Great.
your talk in such a context. But that's a good question about in fact we thought the self-organization in physical world and the physical organization in biological world is very different.
Yes.
The difference is in the physical world is follow the energy status more stable in lower status, but in biology is opposite. As long as you have energy to suppress such a system, therefore, so the self-organization and the meaning become different from physics. So that's the point one.
Absolutely
So
true.
so therefore, then what is key difference then, right? So in fact, what you're talking about now we know everything you have to be a circle they can maintain, right? So that's the idea from the chemical circle to biological circle and to culture circle, whatever in such a way. But so therefore the one of the key idea is well, of course, everything we want to maintain in biology is a biological constraint. So therefore, we actually thinking biological information is the constraint. But so because I have different level of structure, so we have a different level of constraint. So by short, that constraint is inheritance. So that's our theory, right? With such. So the problem is what's the big deal and what is the relationship between self-organization? We actually realize there's a more fundamental in biology is information self-creation process.
Yes.
So that actually solves the paradox. You're thinking, so how could initially they will have some intention to do? In fact, the intentionally, I agree with you, is the last step. That's called evolution. So therefore, they actually treat all the function equally, but which one is useful is determined by evolutionary process. So therefore, the key here, perhaps, it is the information self-creation process, which actually is a chain reaction to link with the physical self-organization. So therefore, we think it's information self-creation, perhaps in biology, even more important than self-organization principle. So what do you think?
No, I agree entirely. And what I'm trying to talk about is a system that will self-create by creating. Now, so reproduction is a case of reproducing constraints, creating new constraints that themselves constrain a dynamical process that can create new constraints. The point I want to make here is that, first of all, the self-organization problem, biology is not non-physical, obviously. It's not non-chemical. Um, the key is that it utilizes self-organizational processes against and with respect to each other. Um, it's not just that it's self-organizing. No. And when you say circular, both of these processes are circular in a sense. You have, in
Yes,
a sense, entangled circles.
but
And that's the only difference between that and something in the non-living world.
So the one of the circle, we are talking about the spiral structure. So every time you have one layer of constraint, so just build up the constraint. So therefore, actually the complexity, increase the complexity maybe is a physical force more fundamental than the thermodynamics law. So that's what we actually, want to push in that direction.
I see what you're saying. And I wouldn't want to say it's more fundamental, but what I would want to say it's a special case in which you have, by unbelievable improbability, brought together processes that have this kind of balance with respect to each other's persistence and existence. And once that's there, this is a very special case. So that if we look throughout the universe, this is going to be the most radically unlikely case. But
Yes.
here's the interesting story. Once it's there, it reproduces itself,
So,
makes more copies of itself. And
so
it
that,
yeah.
yes, that's exactly. So we actually articulation as this is a biological process. Use this constraint, actually use the new information every round to make the miracle become biological routine. Therefore, biological organism is just a platform to do all these impossible things become biological routine. So that's self-dividing everything you deliver. So
Yes,
therefore, they continue use this idea, continue to build up until now. We build up the AI. They have different mechanism now, but so far everything is the same. Is biological cell based. Every life is cell in such a way until right now. Yeah. Anyway, appreciate your idea. We can discuss.
the last step I would be careful of. Um, and that's because what we've done in artificial intelligence or any kind of machine process is that we have literally separated off the self-generation, the self-preservation feature of it. Those processes no longer play any role in how they work, how they're
Exactly.
built. Living systems do. And so, in effect, what we've done is as Wittgenstein says in the last part of his Tractatus, we've pulled up the ladder after ourselves. And, they're no longer grounded. So, what we know about these systems is yes, they're built upon incredible data that we human beings have produced because we're grounded, because we're interacting, because we've got normative issues. But we've now just created these, in a sense, regurgitation machines that do a really good job of using this incredible constraints that we've created to predict what might follow from a series of constraints in a totally ungrounded sense in which it can't interpret. It needs humans to interpret. What is the alpha fold that interprets hundreds of thousands of protein possible configurations? Yeah, it can produce this story, but to make sense of it, you need human beings to make sense of it. We need to have humans interpreting it. They're not able to interpret. And so this is a much bigger question. Uh, so what I'm all I'm saying is that this one of the reasons I want to start small. I want to start simple because I want to get the basic principles clear, and then we can build our way up. And I think even building our way up to organisms, to DNA and RNA, a process that I've been very much interested in recently, how that might have evolved after the first universal common ancestor to become the complicated system that we have. I think we need to get the principles right first. And once we get those principles right, then we can begin the process of figuring out how it might evolve, how it might have been constructed.
So, well, thanks, Terry. That was awesome. So I'm gonna go ahead and ask Luke's question because he's only able to type it in.
Good.
He says, "Hi, Terrence. I came across your auto-generated model about a decade ago and very much enjoyed how it begins with an interactional systemic processes to consider how they might first develop and then evolve various living organizational forming functions. One question I have is, what else is needed to think, to model, to research, to take the autogen model into something that might be a full-blown explanation of the origins of life from Fuka to Luca? What are the most promising research pathways, do you think?"
That's a tough question. Because
Questions.
now we're talking about getting down to the laboratory or whatever. How do we do this? So I've taken a couple of approaches. I can't say any of them have actually worked out well. We've got some good simulations out there, but simulation is just a simulation. It's just a guess. You make some guesses about how it can work. So we can show that, you make a bunch of assumptions and you can get a good simulation out. So it's a very trivial proof of principle. My suspicion is I've done three things. I've number one tried to talk to people who have virus labs who are doing viral work and say, look, this base is based upon viruses. Even when we were doing stuff, we knew how the adenovirus shell was self-assembled. We knew what proteins were in it, and we knew the genes in the virus that stimulated other cells and their ribosomes to produce those proteins. So we knew something about, the processes that generated the shell. So I said, let's back up one step. We know the shell, we know the molecules, we know how they get produced, how they get produced together. Can we produce those molecules catalytically instead of genetically? Can we take other peptides and do that? You know, so that would be one way to go from sort of working backwards from a virus to an autogenic virus. Um, the next approach is I approach these guys from NASA Ames down in the south of the Bay who are thinking about what do we do next to do search for life on other planets. And my comment was, well, maybe we should stop searching for anything that looks like current life. We ought to look for something a whole lot simpler. Autogenic virus-like structures could be produced by all kinds of chemistry that have very little to do with life. Because they're so simple, they ought to be more likely to show up spontaneously. Where would we might look for these? My first suggestion is we might want to go out to Titan and look at the methane seas and look for polymers. In this case, the most likely polymers to form in a methane sea will be something like a hydrogen cyanide polymer. Um, I won't go into all of these chemical details, but basically my comment was, well, we should maybe broaden our conception of what we're looking for. We're not necessarily looking for life, we're looking for something that's like life, something that we're looking for normative chemistry. We might find it out there. So what do you look for? If you're going to look for it on Mars, maybe you want to look for something that looks like viral structures, maybe fossils of viruses. We've seen things like this already in this meteor that was pulled out of the Antarctic now 2 decades, 3 decades ago. Even Bill Clinton was convinced into saying something like he found the hints of life in this meteor because there are all of these little tubes that were formed. A bunch of people said, no, they're too small. Not even bacteria can be that small. Well, viruses can. Uh, so anyway, that was a second suggestion. Beyond that, what about Earth? The problem of Earth is that systems that don't use DNA or RNA are going to be easily destroyed and taken over and eaten up, all of their raw materials, by systems that reproduce so rapidly and so effectively as anything that after Luca. So in that respect, where do we go to find this? Could we find the ancestors of this? And my sense is we might be able to find this in deep petroleum deposits. Why? Because in deep petroleum deposits, there's probably not the raw materials for anything like life, but there are large organic molecules. There's a lot of energy. They're buried where there's no light. Um, Probably relatively sterile environments, but this is an environment where we might find what amount to autogenic viruses. You don't want to call them I think virus is the wrong name now, but so I've sometimes just call these autogens. that we might find them there. What would we look for? We'd have to look for, in a sense, little tiny tetrahedrons made of organic molecules like oils, like all the hydrocarbons that we find there. Of course, we suck this stuff up and then we cook it and we kill anything that would be there, destroy it. We'll never find it in what we do, but we've got such great ability to get at this stuff in the deep earth. We just have to look for it. We have to know what to look for. And I think we could do that. So I think there's a number of ways we can find this. My prediction, and let me just say it right here, is that autogens will be found. And eventually, when they're found, it'll radically change the way we think about the very nature of life and information. But this theory won't do that because people will look at this theory and say, well, this is so complicated. I can't figure it out. Isn't this just a sort of thought experiment, a wavy thing? Yeah, yeah, to some extent, yes, but it's a prediction. And I'm predicting these will exist. These will be found. There won't be life. They'll be simpler than life, but they'll be normative chemistry.
Cool. So
I don't know if
Kate
I'm
Kaufman has her
too
hand
far
up.
away from your question. I'm sorry.
Very. Yeah. Kate, go ahead and unmute yourself. At least I can't hear you.
No,
There we go.
everybody's
There we go.
Hi, Kate.
Hi, everyone. Hi,
There we go.
Terry. It's great
Awesome.
to see you. Apologies for foregoing my shower this morning to listen to you. But I have to say, it's music to my ears to hear you moving in the directions that you're moving in. It's always been, for those of you, Terry and I met at a conference, the same conference I met Stu at way back in 2006.
That's right.
And so it's been really interesting to, anyway, if anyone can get, can wring everything they possibly can out of semiosis and chemistry, it's going to be you. So I've always really appreciated the carefulness that you do. And back on Star Island, when we were at that emergence conference, there was a popular expression about not wanting to punt to quantum mechanics. And I want to ask you, it's just a quick yes or no, because I have better questions. Do you consider that a punt still?
So what I would say is that everything in the material world has a quantum mechanic base. No question about it.
Okay.
So that's true. But the question is to answer the question that we're struggling with. Do you need a quantum mechanical answer? I think we'll learn more about this as we understand the quantum mechanical basis.
Okay. My next question is, what do you think of Mike Levin's work?
I like it, and yet I worry about it.
What are your worries?
My worries have to do is that it has a tendency towards what I would call preformationism.
I gotcha on that. And I can appreciate how, given the history of science and the movements away from all the religious dogma that was there in place of it, have left these kinds of taboos. But I experience them as really preemptive taboos these days, particularly with what we know with quantum biology. And the implications of Michael's work, as far as I'm concerned, are physical implications concerning bioelectricity and patterns that are encoded in bioelectricity that we have not noticed before when we stay at the chemical level. And of course, there's always a chicken and egg thing because the physics gives rise to the chemistry. But I really think that there are deeper ways of analyzing what we see in the existing life forms, the simple life forms like the bacterium, that can give us evidence that just needs to be reinterpreted without these taboos, without bending over backwards to leave the interpreter and the subjective sentient agent out of the machine. So when one pursues that line of thinking, which I have been doing for a long, long time, and I have been suggesting that one of the foundational pieces of the interpretive mechanism is the ability to distinguish some kind of a feeling that feels good and feels bad. So the fact that you are there now with the whole idea of benefit and loss and what that means and how it plays out in our stress chemistry and our entire emotional system, I'm really thrilled about. And I think that we were both speaking at a Biofuel, and you said something that I thought was so cool because I've been saying for a long time, I feel, therefore I am, is the correct cogito. And you said, I feel, therefore I am real. And I love it. Thank you very much. And the reason that I want to add one more layer here is to introduce the laws of form, George Spencer Brown's laws of
My
form.
favorite books.
Awesome. Because there are some of us, in fact, some of us here today in attendance, that have been looking at the idea of the foundational distinction as an act that makes a boundary between somethingness and nothingness, the very kind of boundary that's required for any kind of a living system. An autopoietic system builds its own boundary, but the piece that is missing that we can really focus on is, what do we mean by boundary? How does that boundary condition go there? Because we have an organizationally closed system. It's thermodynamically, informationally, operationally, all of these constraints for the closure. But it's also interacting, exchanging energy, exporting energy with its external environment. So you get this question of, okay, what can we say about boundaries? And the most beautiful thing that has come on my radar is the idea of a self-referential distinction from the laws of form. So you have the circularity, you have the patterning, and you have it's an iterative restructuring of a distinction in every one of these cyclic events that is ultimately at the process of reality creation. So I want to say that that is a very fruitful path because you have, well, especially because emotion is all about the self. It's all about identity. That's the difference between an affective computation and a cognitive computation, which is a thought that leads to other thoughts. Affective computations are all about the self, and they lead to action because this is a fundamental piece of information within the hardware of the machinery, the physical machinery, as well as our experience. And so to me, it implies that there is an agent in the machine, and that to look at what we mean by identity, how it's bounded, and how ideas like Stephen Wolfram's computational design. Of course, we want to get away from the machine metaphor, but the computational metaphor has been very useful. Someone like Stephen Wolfram has done a lot of thinking about this, and he has a whole idea about bronchial space and two different observers. And when you put all of that stuff together with everything you've said, what Spencer Brown is saying, and what the emotional system is doing for us and all living systems, all they need is the simple, what I call the fundamental semantic information bit, which is basically the ones and the zeros. And you can go all the way down to a NAND gate with that. Anyway, so Stephen Wolfram's model is essentially saying that at the very bottom, there are these spaces in, they're spaces. That's it, it's space. But what I'm suggesting is it is also a frame of reference for an identity structure and an agent. And that what relativity is really about is about those reference frames. So you get that, all of that out of Spencer Brown, and you find subjectivity is part of the machinery all the way down. Anyway, I just want to throw all that out there and see what you think. If you already like Spencer Brown, if you're into Wolfram at all, those kinds of things have helped me find a richer story of what we mean by identity, information, agency, and values, because you're talking about normative chemistry when there's clearly norms in the bioelectric patterns that tell the embryo when to stop or when to go ahead and all of that stuff. Okay,
So
that's my question.
So many things to respond to. Let me just pick a couple. And one follows after the Levin question about bioelectric instructions, so to speak, for building an organism. First of all, Mike's work that built this was work done with planaria, flatworms. Flatworms are very unusual animals. They're very unusual animals because they have a weird mixed up genome in which you can have lots of different genome variants that make the same organism. And if you cut them up, they regrow parts. They're more like many plants in this respect. And the important distinction about plants is the way they grow and why they're capable of this. And they're capable of this because cells have a specific place, and they get locked in place if they're a plant by virtue of the cell wall that forces plant cells to be non-mobile. Now, what's weird about planaria is you got to have mobile cells, but they've got to have very specific identity, and yet their identity has to be determined in a way similar to the way plants do. So one of the things I want to say is I think you want to be careful about taking the planarium model and saying that is the generic model. The second part of that story is that when you say there is information in the electrochemical system, and I don't doubt that in planaria it is electrochemical. I do think that that's an important part of it. It has to do with their small sizes also part of this, but I won't go into those details. The question is, what makes it information? What is the interpretive process? You can't just say, oh, it's information because it does X. Oh, yeah, that's great. But you haven't explained anything. You've just sort of backed up one step in the process. So what I'm after here is what, and this is why Charlie's first question is relevant. Or second question, what constitutes the capacity to interpret? To see something that is just a physical property and use it as information about something else. Use it as a way to constrain some other activity. Now, let me jump then next to one other part of what you said. I want to be careful, in part because one of the things I'm trying to do, as you can tell, is starting as simple as possible. So there's nothing up my sleeve. So I'm not making any assumptions. That's really important to do good
I
science.
love that about you. You worked really hard to keep those sleeves open.
Yes, indeed. And this has to do with George Spencer Brown. And one of the reasons I love his work and I'm wary of it. Let me start with just a little brief self-story about George Spencer Brown. When I first went to Harvard as a young graduate student, I was taking classes from who was then, you guys that have deep memories will know this, a guy named Willard Van Orman Quine. He was considered the great man of logic, of symbolic logic, who had created so much of what was modern symbolic logic at the time. And here I was taking classes from him, and it was so exciting. I was learning all this stuff, and I sat down in his office hours and I said, "Okay, now let's talk about George Spencer Brown's laws of form." And he said, "That's junk." And I looked at him and I said, "No, no, this is really great." And he said, "No, George Spencer Brown just stole Scheffer's stroke." Now, Scheffer created this logic with a single operator that he called the not and operator back in the 1930s. And he said you can construct all of logic from a single operator. You don't have to have and or not, all of this stuff, or implication, just a single operator. And I said, no, yeah, but that's not the brilliance of Brown's work. The brilliance of Brown's work is he showed that you need just two relationships, distinction and confusion.
Confusion.
Confusion. This people don't recognize that this is a crucial piece of Brown's very initial story. The equal sign is not that they're identical, it's that you can't distinguish things. Now, I want to be clear. There's identity, which is a really strong claim. And then there's indistinction. Brown uses distinction and indistinction and shows with just those two operations, you can build up a system by building up an arithmetic, then an algebra, then a calculus to get to symbolic logic. And then, of course, in the end of it, he says, but now you can have distinctions that undermine themselves. Notice that my description of self-organization is something that tends to be self-undermining. There's a relationship here. But now here's the interesting thing about this with respect to, just go back now to the autogenic virus model. The autogenic virus model alternates between something that is inert, a set of constraints that are inert, it's closed, it's not doing anything. There's no raw, it's all enclosed. It gets damaged, it breaks open, and catalysts are spilled out, and they start the process of putting the thing back together again. In that process, we've cycled between just its constraints, its constraints get disturbed, its distinctions get disturbed, and it puts those distinctions back together again. It's self-referential in this sense. Now, I want to make a clear distinction now between two kinds of self-referential relationships that I think is important to keep this distinction in mind. One is the basis of Kurt Gödel's finding, which goes back, of course, all the way to the liar's paradox and logical type violations of Russell and so on. And the idea here is that, a statement like this statement is false is self-undermining. And so philosophers often say, well, if you get a statement like that, you've done something wrong, that this is nonsense. No, what it really is you can't stop interpreting. Put interpretation back into the story. Because what it says is I've interpreted it. Oh, now I have to reinterpret it. Oh, now I have to reinterpret it. No, now I have to reinterpret it. You can't stop interpreting. We see a similar sort of thing in mathematics with the square root of -1. You just can't stop interpreting it if you try to solve it. It goes from negative to positive, negative to positive, negative to positive. So just call it I, and we'll create a new dimension, a two-dimensional system. So it's a nice trick to go from one-dimensional mathematics to two-dimensional mathematics. A number of people recognized early on that, it's kind of an open-ended problem because you can have the square root of -I. Oh, and if you have the square root of -I, you've got the same problem again. Oh, you got to deal with that. Well, we'll call that one J. Oh, but then you can have the square root of -J. Oh, shoot. I can't stop this process. Again, it's a doubly unstoppable interpretive process. You can't stop interpreting. You can't stop calculating.
And what's wrong with that?
Oh, nothing wrong, because that's the real world.
That's right.
That's the real world. And that's what we're
well,
dealing with here.
well,
But-
there's one more thing I want to throw into the mix here. Is we're at the very bottom, we're discussing the formation of what a boundary of identity is, right? And I've thrown out there the idea of a distinction, which comes with it both a foreground, a background, and a perceptual, relative perceptual.
You've got an observer in your picture.
I've got an observer in my picture.
Okay.
And in fact, I have a self in my, yes, I have an observer in my picture, and I'm not afraid to show my sleeves that observer is missing from the story. It needs to be in the physical story as well. I think it was in Einstein, but that kind of got dropped out, that motion in sort of a frame makes a difference. So I am going to put an observer in the story and say that what it is observing is it's actually not only observing, it's creating a self-distinction in a foundational iterative act of self-distinctioning, which is the fundamental paradox, the reason why there is paradox in Gödel, where you have limitations to every modeling system, because that's part of the story. That's part of the role of the agent in the machine, the subjective agent in the machine. And so, yes, I am saying that. But when we
So
talk,
the danger, let me just stop, because the danger here is you've got a homunculus, and
I don't buy the
that
homunculus
homunculus
story.
is
I
another
don't buy the
homunculus.
homunculus story.
Okay.
I read your book, I understand the argument, and I don't buy it. I'm thinking more of sort of a nested kind of holism.
No,
But
I agree, but
what
I don't see how
I
you can
want to query
explain
you
it.
about the environment, okay? Because the boundary is not only the identity, it's also the relationship to the environment.
Right,
And so from Darwin, we hear that the environment is a selector. From the wonderful Scott Gilbert, developmental person, we hear that the environment is an instructor. And from Wojtek Zurek, the guy that wrote the book on decoherence, we hear that the environment is a witness. So all three of those functions have to do with our question of what we mean by the environment. And so in adding the bioelectric sort of story with an observer and with the quantum aspects of it, you have a much richer story about normative physics, if you will,
right,
because
but the
norm
norms,
is a
but the
norm
norms are
is
assumed. Well, I want a system that explains where the norms come from. That is,
okay.
how norms emerge from non-normative.
Let's talk about the fact that if there is an observer and
No,
that
no,
there
but an
are
observer
computational
is complicated. Observer is
there
incredibly
are
complicated.
resonance patterns physically that have to do with our experience of time, space, and self. So there is a story that goes further down. And I don't consider it a punt, but I don't want to badger you. And I know there are a lot of other people here that have questions.
So
Um,
let me do one more piece on the George Spencer Brown, because this is an important part of our story here. And this
it
is
is.
what does link back to Stu. And Stu and I years ago went back and forth on an argument about the nature of work.
So do we. He
Yeah,
makes a
so
distinction between happenings and doings, and work falls in that domain of behavior, right?
that what
If-
I don't want to get too high on this one.
Okay,
Uh, I want to stay at the bottom level here. So there's no magic. For me, so let me just do the Gödel story first,
okay.
because Gödel is about formal systems, that you can't have a complete and consistent formal system that's both complete and formal, and therefore there's always incompleteness. But notice that this is a formal system. I like to distinguish this is what Doug Hofstadter would call a strange loop,
Exactly. That's the
self-reference.
self-referential
But now
action
there's
I'm talking about.
so I want to get to a different level of self-reference, because I think this is a critical piece of the story. And that is what I call an Escherian strange loop. There's Gödelian strange loops, and there's Escherian. This is, go back to Doug Hofstadter, Gödel, Escher, Bach. Escher has a couple of wonderful pictures where he draws an
I love those
observer
pictures. Sure.
observing the world in which he's the observer. That is, he's
It's
observing.
Ouroboros as well, the
Yeah,
chase,
exactly.
guiding the tail.
So here's the question. What I call an Escherian strange loop is not a Gödelian strange loop. A Gödelian strange loop is one in which there's a formal system in which the relationship between one formal expression and another formal expression have this sort of part whole confusion, this logical type breakdown that Russell talks about. An Escherian one is in which, notice that in a formal system, we ignore the fact that the very sign vehicles that we construct the formal system on are actually physical in some sense, whether they're just text on a page or what. They have physical embodiment. An Escherian strange loop is different in the following sense. It's a strange loop in which the formal relationship determines the physical embodiment of the formal relationship.
That's exactly what I just said the distinction does.
Well, and what I want to do is,
Self-referential distinction in a
right,
physical sense.
So what I want to say is that that's exactly what the autogenic system does.
So is there an
In
observer?
which the constraint system generates not only the constraints, but also informs, you might say, the physics that embodies that constraint. It's an Escherian strange loop. And that's why it's incomplete, why it will always be open-ended, why there's always an evolutionary process.
So
We
the
need to
Escherian,
distinguish between Gödelian strange loops and Escherian strange loops.
okay, I like that distinction. And the Escherian strange loop, by your definition, then would be some aspect of our identity that is like a field, because it is informational and yet it's unique to my geometry, my location, my motion in space and movement, all of that. And it is what some people would call if there is an energy aura or presence of the body, then that is captured in this idea of this Escherian self-reference that Mike Levin might call the Markov blanket, which is in a computational model, sort of like its mind, its memory structures and all of that. So again, we're back to the issue of the environment and how much of it is actually the self, the informational piece, and how much is it not self. And the foundational sort of comparison that happens in the emotional system is a comparison between self and not self. So it's ultimately
Absolutely.
like a NAND gate. It's like a NAND gate. I mean, this is what triggers the behavior, approach and avoid behavior, and it's all throughout our stress chemistry. And all I'm saying is that it requires an internal representation of that particular piece of the machinery. And that means that there's an agent required in the machine. That's my argument.
And what I'm trying to say is that I want to describe the chemistry that produces agency. I think that an autogenic virus is an agent. And it's an agent because it has the particular self-organizing constraint reproducing capacity that it does.
Does
Now,
it have an identity form?
I don't want to go complex.
Does it
At
have an
this stage,
identity form?
absolutely. And there's a
Okay,
self and there's self-other. There is an environment.
now
There is
you've got the
something in
boundary issue again. Yeah,
but it's not a physical boundary. It's a dynamical boundary. It's
but
a
there you go. Okay,
it's a boundary of constraint. That which fits, that which doesn't fit, that which is
it's
other, that
also
which is other
it's a
and can become self.
it's a whole juxtaposed to a specific time-space environment. Just like your body is a collection of parts and wholes, but you're the one that gets about with your sensory capacities and your choice-making abilities. You're the top-down constraint for everything inside your body through your experiences of pleasure and pain. That's the coarse-grained logic of the machinery and the software.
But now you've taken us all the way up to animals, and animals as smart as we. I'm just trying to go to the very bottom. I can do the evolutionary story if you want. I call this a 1, 2, 3 repeat hierarchy system.
Well,
That
I've
we
used
finally,
I've used your slide from thermodynamics to morphodynamics for teleodynamics for a decade or so. So I'm on board with that, but I think that you got to go below the chemistry. You have to look into deeper physics. That's all I'm saying, but I don't want to argue with you about it. There's other people that want to
right,
say,
no, that's right. So I will still punt.
okay, and I will still hug my homunculus.
I'm sure.
Is that a deal?
Yeah. All right. Charlie, why don't you pick the next speaker? These guys have been waiting a long time. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Wade has a great
Okay,
note.
Wade.
That exchange was beautiful. Thank you guys. I love it. Oh, Wade has a question.
Yeah. So, I mean, I was going to ask Terry to talk about the exaptive nature of the evolution of DNA from an energetic molecule. But I think the connection with Mike Levin is a little bit more important to bring up right now. So, first of all, I want to say that Mike Levin's work is a little bit more than you probably aren't that familiar, that deeply familiar with it. So Mike's work in bioelectrics. First of all, it's not just in planaria, so he discovered this stuff in planaria, but he's actually shown real world applications and actually does this in the laboratory with all kinds of animals. And kind of the point
I'm
is,
aware of it. I was just trying to be as quick
no,
as
that's
I could.
fine. It's fine. I'm not. It's okay. Well, what so I wanted to say is, that, in a way, it kind of ties into your work, and it's actually it's a little bit different mechanism of the formation of emergent constraints, right? So we're talking about cognitive glue, for instance. So we all know that you have these sort of nested cells in biology, where the cells that are at the tissue level and at the organ level and at the organ system level and at the organism level, their goals are highly constrained. And in a lot of ways, you could say that cancer is sort of this process where they become unconstrained and they stop recognizing these higher order goals, right? So, with your teleodynamics and your and the papers that you wrote with what's his name, Kutrafinis, where you looked at dynamical depth and stuff like that. That's one mechanism by which you get the formation of emergent constraints. But once you move from this very basic level of how do we even get this sort of self-sustaining process to arise and how does it scale up, once we get to cell levels, we have cognition. And when we have cognition, this is where this bioelectricity becomes important.
And why? And you call it this? Mike also calls it cognition, using a kind of
Yeah, so here I'm talking kind of like 4E or 6E cognitive science, like someone from like John Vervaeke might talk about. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him.
No, I'm not.
So or it even goes back to Varela, so where you talk about cognition at the cellular level, that is knowing. Knowing as doing, not cognition in the human sense, not a higher, not like self, this is not self-reflective cognition or anything like that. It's more at different basal levels.
Yeah, we'll call it whatever you want to call it. It's clearly not what we're doing right now. There's something.
No, it's clearly not.
Yeah, but so no, okay, we'll agree. I just worry about using a term that's
It can be
at the top and then.
That's why I hate to use the word consciousness.
Yes,
I instead use the word cognitive process, and I'm going thinking it's sort of like John's modern take on Neoplaton, sort of Neoplatonist philosophy, where we're really talking about a contact, like knowing as conformity, as being. So as you're knowing your environment is mutually knowing you in a certain sense. But that's probably not a very good way to discuss it, because you do bring in these homunculi when you start to do that.
That's right. All this stuff sneaks in. So that, your sleeve is getting more complex when you start doing this. I'm just trying to be, as you can tell, I'm trying to be as stripped down as possible so that I don't sneak any assumptions into it. And so you need to tell me, where I'm sneaking assumptions. But then if we've got this worked out, then we've got a foundation we can build up on. My worry with Mike and I have had these conversations, I should say. Basically, I think that would amount to electrical potentials and non-synaptic connections between neurons and between other cells that use electrical potentials are part of the process. I don't disagree with that. I think that for large organisms like myself, they probably play a role early on in embryonic development, but then the distances we're talking about become very, very large, and you need something else. You need more chemical gradients to drive stuff. So I don't have a problem with that.
Well, I think his point is that these are sort of how the chemical gradients know what to do. I hate to use that word when I'm talking about the chemical gradients, but
it's for that language. That's exactly the reason we tend to go there, that I'm sensitive to. I'm sensitive to that because as soon as you say that, you're making some assumptions about what information is. You're making some assumption about what interpretation is. I don't want to do that. I want to generate it as opposed to assume it.
Right. So for the cell, for instance, so I take a cell. to pick any cell type you want. We're even before, maybe not even talk about development, because that really gets to be complex. So we just have a cell that's in a body that's already full, and the cell, if it were not part of the body and you just put it in a growth medium, it would have certain goals and certain things that it's trying to do to perpetuate its existence. And then you put it into a tissue, and a lot of things are constrained. And the questions that Mike is really interested in is, how is it that at these different levels of organization, the sort of goals, the teleological goals that these things are pursuing are constrained.
And my question is very similar. And the question that I have is, how are new levels of teleology emergent? What do they emerge from? What's the foundation out of which they show up for the first time? And this happens embryologically as well. Embryos differentiate. They start out undifferentiated, and new information is generated by this interaction of a cell with its environment. Some of that information, I think, at a very small level, does have electrical potentials driving it. I think as embryos get bigger and bigger, and what we see is that the information gets shifted more and more towards the chemical. In some respects, that's not an issue for me. And I should say, I spent all of my early career, of course, looking at development of nervous systems, using stem cells, using cross-species neural transplantation, looking at how brains develop. I'm very, very, very much interested in that process, and I recognize that that's true. What I'm trying to get to is something more basic than all of that. I don't want to make the assumption of interpretation. I want to provide a mechanism where we can say, if it's got these properties, it's interpreting. And I don't doubt that some of these cases that Mike is dealing with, including limb regrowth and things like that, that he's interested in, have some of
Terry,
those.
Terry, can I interrupt? So I have one question I want to slip in, and hopefully leave enough time for Mary's question later. But it
He's
relates
been very
exactly to
patient.
this, like, bare bones. What's that?
I want to be clear that I'm going
I'm
to
sorry.
have a strong break at noon, my time. So
How did it go?
Me
yeah,
too. Well, yeah, I break at the hour. Got a hard stop at the hour as well, so
good.
we'll have to cut off at that point. But I did want to include in this discussion. I wanted to push. So you have this minimal bare bones model of interpretation. But what I'm hearing is interpretation of the symbols inscribed in DNA, right? Like I'm hearing this upward interpretation process where, like, the symbolic information that's gotten into DNA by virtue of natural selection is now interpreted to become constraints on the organism. And here's the real crux of, like, what I want to push on. So I don't think anyone really doubts that like inheritance, it results in, symbolic information that gets interpreted by organisms, and that provides constraints or affordances or causes. So all the problems in the theory of life come from the other direction. All the problems in the current theory of the current paradigm of biology come from occasions where the world is pushing on the organism. And the organism is using the world to change its interpretation, or to change its usefulness of its DNA, right? So instead of using the symbols in the DNA to change the way, to constrain the way it uses the world, it's using the world to constrain the way it uses its DNA. And often, so, like, let me just make explicit. So these are like, horizontal gene transfer, transposition, duplication, non-random mutation, epigenetic inheritance. So these Lamarckian ways that the world is being used to push back on the DNA. And so I thought your model was going to address that direction of interpretation, the downward causation direction. And that's the part where I really like I'm trying to take a Deaconian view of that process, and I need I'm hoping you can make it more explicit for me.
Okay, you've asked for a whole other couple of hours of work here, but so first of all,
I know. I'm
I'm going to
so
be clear that
sorry.
I want to be clear that I think we're confused about the Lamarckian story. We think that we need Darwin and Lamarck together. Lamarck, I think, is a too high order misunderstanding of the process. We sneak this in with epigenetic inheritance stuff as well. I think people misunderstand genetic inheritance as Lamarckian, and it's fundamentally different. Um, the key story here is not that the environment constructs. The environment provides constraints. The organism generates constraints. And the organism has to, in a sense, take advantage and avoid constraints of the environment. Um, and as a result, internalizes those features, creates internal models in the process. We've not even talked about the evolutionary process yet in this discussion. I've just tried to put us right at the bottom of the story. I think we fundamentally still misunderstand the evolutionary process. And I think a big part of it has to do with the fact that organisms are not just trying to keep up with the second law of thermodynamics. They have to always stay ahead of it. And that means they have to produce redundancy. And redundancy produces error protection, tolerance to error. The more redundancy you have, but redundancy also produces another capacity. And that capacity is new synergies. Because if you produce redundant elements, redundant functions like redundant legs for insects, and now you have redundancy, you can afford to have legs that do something slightly different. They can degenerate. The second law of thermodynamics can take some of these redundant elements and cause them to degenerate. But now you have theme and variation relationships. And theme and variation relationships can become synergistic. Evolution has a way to do play. It's not all work and no play. It's got natural selection is a subtractive process. The generative process is not just error. The generative process is building redundancy and allowing errors to accumulate in the redundancy where they're protected. And now you can use that. To build up from what I've just described, which is very, very simple, you need a series of processes that do both that, and they have to have this offloading process. You've got to find a way to take your constraints and make them more distant than your actual metabolism. The case of RNA and DNA is that the dynamics of catalysis and assembly have become offloaded onto a molecular structure. The nice thing about constraints, as I described, even in talking about taking a DNA sequence, turning it into A's, G's, C's, and T's, is that constraints are multiply realizable. You can transfer them to other materials. And then so long as you have a way to transfer them back or to something else is usable, that's fine. So, but to do that, you've got to offload it. So the story with DNA is it's this incredibly robust linear molecule. It's incredibly robust and it's relatively separated from all of the dynamics of the cell. RNA molecules are not, but that's why they're always the intermediary. To have a good recording medium and a good medium where you can do reproduction that has high fidelity, you want to have something that's completely offloaded from the dynamics of the cell to be just a structure. So we've offloaded. Now, the nice thing is that constraints can be just simply structures, not just statistical probabilities, but structures. That's what A's, G's, C's, and T's are. They're just structures in a text. But we can use that as an affordance to offload into something more dynamic. The bad news is we've only got these 2 hours, and I've got to respond to Mary here before we run out of time. She's been so patient.
Totally. Go for it, Mary.
Thanks, Terrence. Well, so it'll be easier since I read it out. I'm in the process of formulating a project exploring what I call holonic biology and life homologies, separate related ideas. I speculate that it will be useful to look at homologies in behavior across holons and use the articulated patterns that emerge to predict at other levels and see how far we can push them down, perhaps all the way to the molecular or further. I see biology as a black box from which certain behaviors emerge. All that being said, I see specific patterns of recursion in behavior and material cycling, for example. And I want to ask how you, Terrence, understand recursion in relationship between organism and environment. And then just for a little context, I've been writing the book Utopia, which is looking at material cycling, and is sort of expanding the Gaia theory, I just thought, what happens if we look at cows and other ungulates in the center of material cycling? And it's it's been wildly enthusiastically received by ecologists and animal biologists and ranchers and atmospheric chemists because nobody takes this approach, and it reveals a lot about what's really happening when you look at things from these relationship level. So I wanted to just give that as background and see what you have to say.
Wow. Well, um, obviously what we're talking about is how an ecology gets created.
Exactly.
And what you're dealing with, of course, is once it's created, it differentiates and gets more and more complicated. Everything gets more and more codependent. And that codependence relationship is the real issue. One of
It's
the
homeoretic. It just keeps moving forward.
That's right. That's right. And it gets the title of the book that I'm just about finished with is called Falling Up. I stole the title from one of my favorite children's writers, Shel Silverstein. Um, uh, but Falling Up basically says that the process that evolution complexifies by is not a process of work. Again, this all work, no play story. I think of natural selection as, getting rid of the stuff that's not working so well, as needing, in a sense, it's the yang that you need a yin for. And the yin is this duplication process and then error tolerance, degradation. The argument I'm making is that you've got to have these two processes together to generate higher order complexities, new reciprocities, new codependences, new synergies. You need that.
So the yin is the creative
Yes.
void, the chaos, the um, the Shakti energy. Okay, so then what I've observed is that in all of the recursive processes, for example, in methane in the gut of a specific cow, in the cycling between the methanotrophs and the methanogens in a rice paddy. The magic of them for the ecosystem is that they're all incomplete. Methane escapes in every case.
Right, right.
And so they end up being part of the next larger cycle and the next larger cycle. So the methane cycle is made up of many incomplete methane cycles that escape methane that go into a larger cycle that's also complete, and so on and so forth. So when I describe this stuff to biologists or atmospheric chemists, they say, "Yeah," and I haven't put it in the book yet because I wasn't sure I knew what I was talking about. But I feel like there's really something here that, as I said, looking at biology as a black box, I don't claim to understand. We can still see that there's these patterns that are emerging and magnifying themselves in a manner that sounds very similar to what Robert Rosen was describing. And I also see Kantian holes, which Stuart Kaufman talks about, and so forth.
That so many things to talk about in the last 5 minutes here.
Well, perhaps we can have another session. I want to put you and Judith on the stand at the same time and
Oh yeah, we have a
with
lot in common,
questions.
and particularly the anticipatory side of things, which
Yes.
is absolutely critical to what
The
I've been talking
anticipatory
about.
is huge. I'm learning so much about that from the animal ecologists. They talk about how, for example, Fred Provenza is incredibly wise about this. He did 300 research papers on this. Animals will adapt their guts to eating certain plants and animals. And so that because they are in a predictive state of being able to continue to eat those in the environment, but then their poo and, helps those particular plants to continue to grow in that environment.
And they have to get there somehow from
Right.
context that wasn't that way initially. And that's the real interesting challenge. Um, so all of this is great. So there's a group of molecular biologists that talk about leaky functions. You're talking about
That's
leaky.
what I'm talking about. That's what I want to learn more about. Leaky
Okay.
functions.
So there's a whole series, and let me give you a simple example that sort of drove my thinking about this years ago. Has to do with why you and I need to eat vitamin C. Why do we need now? What was in about 1994? A group of Japanese researchers were looking in the rat genome, and they actually identified the gene that produces the protein, the enzyme that generates vitamin C endogenously in the rat. All mammals, with a few exceptions, anthropoid primates like you and I are some of those exceptions, generate their own vitamin C. This is true of fish. It's true of lots of other animals. Uh, and that's because ascorbic acid is a terrific antioxidant. Um, the question is, what about us? Why don't we do it? Well, the bottom line is one of the first things these guys did was to say, okay, let me tag this gene and see if I can bind it to the human genome. Do we have anything like it in the human genome? And by golly, it was there. It's just a gene that's full of noise. It's got a frame shift mutation that makes it total nonsense,
Right.
but it's there. Um, and now comparing the human to chimpanzees, to rhesus monkeys, and to marmosets, and I can't remember all the ones that they looked at. But it turns out we can now construct the phylogeny of how that gene began to degrade. And it begins to degrade in the lineage leading to us and all these other primates, somewhere around 50 to 60 million years ago.
Mhm.
What's going on is that we also see in the fossil record that the ancestors of primates, their eyes before this are large, and they have teeth that are ideal for eating insects. They were basically nocturnal insect hunters. But at roughly this period of time, their eyes get small, and their teeth become better for crushing things. This is fruit eating.
I was just going to say that's the transition to fruit.
That's the transition to fruit. Now, what's going on with fruit is interesting because fruit had up to this point almost certainly been cross-pollinated, um, and seeds have been passed around by birds. A great way to pass things around because they go long distances and stuff like that. Birds have always, and their ancestors, we think and assume, the dinosaurs have probably always made their own vitamin C. But in this respect, one of the things that's interesting is that if primates start competing with birds for vitamin C, they now have redundancy. If they're in the trees and constantly eating enough fruit to compensate for this, now their gene can tolerate errors. And
Right.
so over the course of time, these errors have accumulated. Now, one of the other things that's happened at the same time, and this has happened in the old world monkeys and in one lineage of new world monkeys, and that is that they've developed three color vision. They've
Yeah,
done
I
so.
might have to interrupt.
Yep.
Um,
Oh yeah, we're running out of time here. We got 2 minutes to go.
I'm
So
so sorry. Yeah, we only got a minute and a half.
let me just
I
end
have
this
a hard
quickly. So one of
stop.
one of the things
Yeah.
that's happening is that three color vision happened by virtue of duplication of one of the opsons on the X
Right.
chromosome. Okay, that happens about the same time. Why? Because if you're eating fruit, you need to identify when it's ripe, when it's not full of all kinds of troublesome things. But the key for fruit is if you want to keep something that's there a long time for your dispersers, you want to keep the sugar there. You don't want oxygen to destroy the sugar. So you got to have lots of antioxidants in it. So it's this perfect system where you got fruit that's now a leaky system that primates can take advantage of, but there's a consequence for primates taking advantage of it. They lose the capacity, and now you and I are addicted to dietary vitamin C. So it's a variant of your story. But what I want to say is I think that's the model again and again and again and again that we're talking
Well,
about.
that's what I see too. And so I'm glad that you gave me a name for it. Um, there's so many instances looking at whole animal ecology and uh, whole animal biology and plant ecology, where these leaky systems are what's running the forward motion, not only the homeostasis to whatever way you can imagine that, which is imaginary, and the homeoresis of all of these holonic levels. And I really would like to be able to write something that would provide all different levels of biologists with some tools for being able to do a kind of quick, abductive analysis. I think it would be so helpful to be able to see what you're looking at so much of the time.
Guys,
Does
guys,
that
I'm
make
so
sense?
sorry to interrupt. I'm so sorry to interrupt. I've got a hard stop at 12 and we're
Okay, well,
already
thank you
there.
so much, Charlie and Terrence and Judith and everyone else. This was a great conversation.
It has been fun. I'm sorry that we can't keep going, but
Mhm.
we all have a hard stop. Maybe we can pick this up at some other point.
Absolutely. I just wanted to thank you so much, Terry. This has been wonderful, and just invite you to be a part of this group going forward if you choose. And we've all been greatly enriched today, and I really I'm so grateful for all the preparation, and I'm grateful to all of you guys for joining in and asking terrific questions and thinking hard about this stuff. So. And I'm sorry we didn't get every idea surfaced on the table, but
It's
we're making
a large
progress. So
set.
thank you guys.
And by the way, you're welcome. Anybody's
Absolutely.
welcome to write to me
Absolutely.
for papers or anything else. Deacon@berkeley.edu. It's easy.
Okay.
Just remind me of this context and happy to share whatever. Thank you all.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Many of you
Very
again.
much.
We'll see you next time.
Okay.
All right. Okay.
Right.
Fantastic.
Thanks so much, Charlie. That was really a piece that I
Okay.
need.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. No, it worked out great. And
I thought I was
yeah,
going to die waiting for 40 minutes, but I did it.
I'll see you guys.
All right. See you guys.
That was
See you guys
intense.
later.
That's great. Good problem to have.